For a generation of Disney World visitors, it was the ride that made you feel like you were actually sinking beneath the ocean. Then one day, without much warning, it was gone. This is the rise and fall of Disney World's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the ride that started with a movie. To understand why this attraction existed at all, you have to go back to 1954. That year, Walt Disney released 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as a live-action feature film through Buena Vista Distribution. It was based on Jules Verne's 1870 novel, a story about a mysterious submarine captain named Nemo, his technologically impossible vessel the Nautilus, and the reluctant passengers dragged into his undersea world. The film was a major production by any standard. It starred Kirk Douglas as the harpooner Ned Land, James Mason as the brooding Captain Nemo, and Peter Lorre and Paul Lucas in supporting roles. It was shot in CinemaScope, had a budget of around $5 million, enormous for a Disney production at the time, and it won 2 Academy Awards for Best Art Direction and Best Special Effects. More importantly, it was a massive box office success. The film grossed over $8 million in its initial release, making it one of the top-grossing films of 1954. Walt Disney, who never missed an opportunity to turn a successful film into a park experience, filed that away. The source novel itself had already been captivating readers for nearly a century before the film appeared. Jules Verne published 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in French in 1870, and it had been in print continuously ever since. The story of Captain Nemo, a brilliant, embittered man who retreated from human civilization into the depths of the ocean, aboard his technologically advanced submarine, the Nautilus, tapped into something deep in the Western imagination. The idea of a self-contained world beneath the sea, operating outside the rules and conflicts of the surface world, had a romantic power that translated across cultures and generations. Walt Disney understood that power intuitively. He also understood that the 1954 film had introduced Verne's story to a generation of American children who had grown up without much awareness of the original novel. Those children were now the audience for his California theme park, and he wanted to give them a physical version of the experience the film had conjured. When Disneyland opened in California in 1955, the park included a submarine voyage attraction, a fleet of submarine ride vehicles that carried guests beneath an artificial lagoon past various underwater scenes. It wasn't directly themed to the Jules Verne film, but the conceptual DNA was obvious. Disney had found a format that worked, building something bigger in Florida. When Walt Disney World opened in Orlando in October 1971, the Imagineers had a blank canvas far larger than anything they had worked with in Anaheim. The Magic Kingdom was bigger than Disneyland, and the team intended to fill it with attractions that pushed beyond what California had done. The Florida version of the submarine ride would be different from Disneyland's submarine voyage. It would be directly themed to the 1954 film, fully branded as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and it would be substantially more elaborate. The lagoon built for the attraction was enormous, reportedly the largest man-made body of water in Florida at the time of construction, covering about 11.5 acres. The ride itself opened with the park on October 1st, 1971, as one of the anchor attractions of Fantasyland. Guests boarded full-scale replica Nautilus submarines, 2-story vessels capable of carrying 40 passengers at a time, and descended beneath the surface for an approximately 8-minute journey through scenes inspired by the film. The scale of the operation was staggering. The attraction ran a fleet of 14 submarines, each one a serious piece of engineering. The lagoon was 7 feet deep, not exactly the crushing depths of the ocean, but enough to sell the illusion when combined with portholes, lighting effects, and carefully crafted underwater scenery. Building the lagoon was itself a significant undertaking. The Florida terrain required excavation on a scale that shaped the surrounding area of Fantasyland. The sheer volume of water involved, 11 acres of it, meant that the lagoon was a defining geographic feature of that corner of the park, not just a backdrop for a ride. What greeted guests beneath the surface was a carefully designed environment that included giant sea creatures, an underwater cave system, a lost Atlantis sequence, and the eruption of an underwater volcano. Giant squids and sea serpents appeared through the portholes. Mermaids rested on rocks. The production design had a theatrical quality that matched the grandeur of the film it was based on. As one former cast member later recalled, people would get off that ride absolutely convinced they had been underwater. The kids especially. Their eyes were huge. They genuinely thought they'd seen a sea monster. The boarding experience itself was part of what made it memorable. The dock area had a scale and theatricality that few other Magic Kingdom queues matched. Guests didn't just stand in line, they entered a world before the ride even began. The sounds of water, the period maritime props, the visual design that placed you firmly in a Jules Verne universe, all of it worked together to prime guests for what was coming. And then, the hatch closed. The water rose past the porthole, and the surface world disappeared. For 8 minutes, you were somewhere else entirely. That was the promise Walt Disney had made when he first envisioned the submarine format. And in Florida, for 23 years, the attraction delivered on it. The mechanics of the magic. Understanding what made this attraction work, and what eventually helped doom it, requires a look at how it actually operated. The submarines didn't actually submerge. The ride vehicles were air-conditioned, sealed cabins that rode on a track just beneath the water's surface. As a submarine entered the lagoon and guests looked through the portholes, the visual field was entirely underwater. The bubbles rising past the porthole windows were generated mechanically. The lighting was carefully controlled so guests couldn't see the surface above them. The illusion of submersion was total. It was a significant technical achievement for 1971. Walt Disney himself had pushed for the submarine rides as a format because he was fascinated by the idea of putting guests in an environment they could not normally access. The Florida version improved on Disneyland's version with more sophisticated animatronic figures and a more cohesive narrative tied to the film. Each submarine was a full 2-story vessel. Guests entered from a boarding dock, descended below the waterline to their seating level, and looked out through individual portholes approximately 18 inches in diameter. The porthole design was deliberate, small enough to limit peripheral vision and keep guests focused on the carefully framed underwater scenes, large enough to give an adequate view of the action. The lagoon water was dyed a specific shade of blue-green to maximize visibility through the portholes while maintaining the illusion of depth. Maintaining that water quality in an open-air lagoon in the Florida climate, with algae, heat, rain, and the wear of constant traffic, was an ongoing challenge from day one. The queue itself was an experience. Guests wound through a dockside area designed to resemble a late 19th century maritime port, consistent with the Victorian-era science fiction setting of the Jules Verne story. Props, signage, émeraudes, and ambient design all worked together to set the scene before anyone boarded a submarine. At peak operation, the attraction could cycle through enormous numbers of guests. With 14 submarines running continuous loops, the throughput was substantial, a necessary feature for a park that was drawing millions of visitors annually. The golden years. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was one of the signature experiences of the Magic Kingdom. It sat at the far end of Fantasyland, a destination attraction that drew visitors across the park. The length of the queue on a typical summer day was a testament to how much guests wanted to be on it. For many families who visited Disney World during this era, the submarine ride occupies a particular place in their memory. It was different from the other Fantasyland attractions in tone. Darker, more atmospheric, more genuinely suspenseful in moments. The appearance of the giant squid through the porthole was a legitimately startling moment for younger guests. The volcano sequence had a dramatic weight that felt unusual for a theme park attraction aimed at families. The 1954 film had remained a touchstone for a certain generation of Disney fans, and the ride kept that film alive in a way that few other park attractions maintained their source material so directly. Captain Nemo's World, the Victorian-era submarine full of pipe organs and velvet curtains, had a romantic quality that the ride translated effectively into a physical environment. Disney periodically updated and refreshed the attraction through its operational life. Animatronic figures were repaired and sometimes upgraded. The underwater scenes were adjusted, The basic structure remained consistent. Board the submarine, descend, pass through the underwater world, surface, disembark, but the production team worked to keep the experience fresh. Through the mid-1980s, the ride maintained its position as one of the most beloved attractions in the park. Guest satisfaction surveys consistently placed it among the favorites. Children who had been on it grew up and brought their own children back to experience it. That multi-generational quality was not incidental. The ride had been open long enough by the early 1980s that parents who had ridden it as children in the early 1970s were now bringing their own kids. It had achieved that rare status for a theme park attraction. It was part of family tradition. Losing it would mean severing that thread for everyone who had been passing it down. The problems begin to mount. The 1980s brought changes to Disney World that began, slowly, to alter the equation for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The park was expanding. Epcot Center opened in 1982, adding a second theme park to the resort and spreading attendance across a larger footprint. Disney MGM Studios opened in 1989. The resort was becoming genuinely enormous, and guest expectations were rising alongside it. Meanwhile, the submarine attraction was aging. The fleet of 14 submarines represented a substantial maintenance burden. These were large, mechanically complex vehicles operating in an outdoor lagoon in the Florida climate, a combination that creates maintenance headaches at the best of times. The warm water, the humidity, and the constant operation took a steady toll on the ride vehicles and the underwater scenes. The animatronic figures that had impressed guests in 1971 looked increasingly dated by the late 1980s. Technology had advanced significantly. The audio animatronic figures in newer attractions, like the Haunted Mansion expansions and the Epcot pavilions, operated at a level of sophistication that made the older underwater figures look crude by comparison. The lagoon's water quality remained a persistent challenge. Maintaining the visibility and color of 11 acres of open-air water in central Florida required continuous chemical treatment, and algae blooms were a recurring problem. Periodically, the attraction had to close for lagoon maintenance, interruptions that frustrated guests and complicated park operations. The operating costs were substantial, running 14 submarines, maintaining the underwater infrastructure, managing the lagoon, and staffing a high-throughput attraction required significant resources. When Disney's financial team began examining cost-per-guest experience ratios across the park, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea did not look efficient. There was also a harder competitive reality setting in. Disney World was under serious competitive pressure in the early 1990s from Universal Studios Florida, which had opened in 1990 with attractions that felt genuinely modern, motion simulators, special effects technology, and ride systems that made the aging submarine lagoon look like it belonged to a different era. None of these problems was individually fatal. Together, they formed a case that was difficult to argue against when budget time came around. An attraction that is beloved but expensive, aging but not broken. Facing competition it is not equipped to answer. That is exactly the kind of attraction that ends up in the crosshairs of a financially pressured management team. The final years and closure. By the early 1990s, the signs were not encouraging. The Florida attraction had been showing its age for several years, and the combination of high operating costs and dated technology had put it firmly in the category of rides Disney was reevaluating. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Walt Disney World closed on September 5, 1994. It had been operating for 23 years, a solid run by any theme park standard, but the closure came as a genuine shock to many guests who had not seen it coming. The official reason given was maintenance costs and the need to repurpose the space. The unofficial reality was a combination of everything that had been building for years: aging infrastructure, high operating costs, animatronics that no longer competed with newer attractions, and a corporate appetite for something new in Fantasyland. As one Disney historian later noted, the submarines weren't closed because guests didn't love them. They were closed because the math stopped working. Disney is a business, and eventually the cost of keeping those submarines running exceeded what made sense for a space that could become something else. The closure was poorly communicated to guests. There was no major farewell event, no commemorative merchandise run, no extended final season. One day the attraction was operating, then it wasn't. For guests who had grown up with it and planned visits specifically to ride it, the abruptness was jarring. That abruptness has itself become part of the story. Disney has managed the farewell process for other beloved attractions much better in the years since. Extended final seasons, commemorative merchandise, formal send-off events. The handling of 20,000 League's closure stands in uncomfortable contrast to how the company now treats the retirement of major attractions. And longtime fans have not forgotten it. What happened to the lagoon? After closure, the fate of the attraction's physical footprint became a years-long saga of unfulfilled plans, partial demolition, and changing corporate priorities. The submarines themselves were eventually scrapped. The lagoon, that enormous 11.5-acre body of water, remained in place, drained and silent. The queue structures came down over time. The underwater sets were removed. What was left was an awkward gap in Fantasyland. A huge, empty space that Disney had no immediate plan for. The lagoon's footprint was simply too large and too structurally specific to repurpose quickly or cheaply. Filling it in would have been a significant engineering project. Redeveloping it as a new attraction would require years of planning. For a time, concepts for a replacement attraction were rumored and occasionally confirmed. A new version of the submarine ride with updated technology was reportedly considered. Various intellectual properties were attached to the space in planning documents over the years. None of them moved forward quickly enough to matter. The empty lagoon sat at the back of Fantasyland for years, visible from various points in the park, a quiet reminder of what had been there. Regular visitors noticed it. Longtime fans photographed it. It became a symbol, fairly or not, of how Disney sometimes handled its own history. The vegetation around the former lagoon site gradually went untended as it awaited a new purpose. What had been a carefully manicured dockside environment with period-appropriate theming became an overgrown, fenced-off area that guests could see but not access. For people who remembered the submarines, walking past that fenced perimeter and seeing the empty basin was not exactly a great look. Disney was not unaware of the optics. They just didn't move particularly fast to fix them. Some of the original underwater props and set pieces ended up in unexpected places. Cast members salvaged items. Disney sold off some materials at auction. A few pieces found their way into private collections. A handful of photographs and some video footage shot by guests during the ride's operational years became primary documents for enthusiasts trying to preserve its memory. The broader context of Disney attraction closures. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea did not close in isolation. The 1990s were a period of significant upheaval in the Magic Kingdom's attraction roster, and understanding what happened to the submarine ride requires understanding the corporate climate that produced those decisions. Michael Eisner's Disney was aggressively expansionist in the late 1980s and early 1990s, opening new parks, building new resorts, and committing to large capital expenditures across the company. By the early 1990s, the financial pressure from those expansions, combined with the failure of Euro Disneyland, which opened in 1992 to disappointing attendance and significant cost overruns, was squeezing the entire organization. Maintenance budgets at the domestic parks came under scrutiny. Attractions with high operating costs and aging infrastructure became candidates for closure. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea fit that profile precisely. Other beloved Magic Kingdom attractions closed during this same general period. Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, one of the original Fantasyland rides, closed in 1998. The original Mickey Mouse Revue, a popular audio animatronic stage show, had already gone. 20,000 Leagues was part of a broader pattern of Disney replacing older, more expensive to operate attractions with newer, more cost-efficient experiences. What made the submarine ride's loss particularly acute for longtime fans was the scale of it. This wasn't a small walk-through exhibit. It was a major, physically enormous attraction that had defined a corner of the park for over 2 decades. Losing it left a visible, literal hole in the landscape. The decision also reflected a shift in how Disney was valuing its intellectual property. By the early 1990s, the studio was in the middle of a new animation renaissance. The Little Mermaid in 1989, Beauty and the Beast in 1991, Aladdin in 1992, The Lion King in 1994. Each of those films was a potential park attraction, generating licensing revenue and drawing younger audiences who had no connection to a 1954 live-action adaptation of a Jules Verne novel. Corporate logic pointed clearly in one direction. Sentimentality pointed clearly in another. Corporate logic tends to win those arguments. The new Fantasyland and what came after. The space that 20,000 leagues under the sea had occupied remained in various states of limbo for years. The lagoon was eventually drained and partially modified as planning for Fantasyland's future evolved. When Disney finally moved forward with a major Fantasyland expansion, announced in 2009 and opened in phases between 2012 and 2014, the old submarine lagoon footprint was incorporated into what became known as the new Fantasyland expansion. This was the largest expansion in Magic Kingdom history, adding significant new space and multiple attractions to a land that had remained largely unchanged since 1971. The area was transformed into a forest of enchantment, themed to Beauty and the Beast and the Little Mermaid. The Under the Sea Journey of the Little Mermaid attraction opened in 2012, occupying part of the physical footprint where the old submarine lagoon had been. The irony of replacing a 20,000 Leagues themed underwater adventure with a Little Mermaid ride was not lost on longtime Disney fans, who appreciated the aquatic connection while mourning what had come before. Storybook Circus, themed to Dumbo and the early Mickey Mouse cartoons, also opened as part of the expansion and occupies land adjacent to the former 20,000 Leagues area. The Be Our Guest restaurant, housed in Beast's Castle, sits on land that was part of the old attractions zone as well. The transformation was thorough. Little physical trace of the submarine attraction remained after the expansion was complete. For those who had watched the empty lagoon sit idle for more than 15 years, the new Fantasyland expansion brought closure of a different kind. The space finally had a purpose again. Whether that purpose honored what had come before was, depending on who you asked, either beside the point or exactly the point. The Disneyland version gets a second life. While Walt Disney World said a permanent goodbye to its submarine ride, the story in California took a different turn. Disneyland's submarine voyage had closed in 1998, 4 years after the Florida attraction had already gone dark. The California submarine sat in storage, and the lagoon was drained and quiet for nearly a decade. Then, in 2007, Disneyland reopened the lagoon as Finding Nemo's Submarine Voyage, a complete retheme using the characters from Pixar's 2003 film Finding Nemo. The basic ride system and lagoon infrastructure were preserved. The new attraction used digital projection technology inside the portholes rather than physical underwater sets, creating a very different kind of visual experience than the original. The California revival demonstrated that the submarine ride format itself still had value. It just needed updated content and technology. The ride system worked fine. The lagoon worked fine. What had aged out was the specific content, not the concept. For Disney World fans who had lost their version over a decade earlier, the Disneyland reopening was bittersweet. It proved the concept was viable. It also confirmed that the Florida lagoon was gone permanently, its footprint already committed to other purposes. The contrast between the two parks' decisions became a recurring reference point in discussions about Disney World's approach to its own heritage. Disneyland preserved and revived. Disney World demolished and built new. Whether that contrast is fair, Disneyland's lagoon is smaller and its real estate pressures are different. Depends on who you ask. Disney fans have been asking each other that question for 20 years and have not reached a consensus. The legacy and the memory. More than 30 years after its closure, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea retains a passionate following among the generation that wrote it. Online forums, social media groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to Walt Disney World history regularly revisit the attraction. Guest videos shot from inside the submarines, grainy, poorly lit footage from camcorders of the 1980s, have accumulated millions of views. What people remember most is the atmosphere, the sense of being genuinely isolated from the surface world, the darkness between scenes, the sudden appearance of the giant squid, the volcanic eruption, the eerie stillness of the underwater sets. For a Fantasyland attraction, a land associated primarily with fairy tales and talking teacups, it occupied a notably atmospheric and moody register. The narration heard aboard the submarines, delivered in a theatrical style consistent with the adventure serial tone of the 1954 film, was memorized by repeat riders. Lines from that narration have been quoted in online forums decades after the attraction closed. That's a peculiar kind of cultural survival, the words of a theme park ride outlasting the ride itself, preserved in the memories of people who were children when they heard them. The ride's soundtrack, an orchestral score that underlined the underwater scenes and the dramatic moments, is another element that former guests recall with specific affection. Theme park music has its own nostalgia ecosystem, and the 20,000 Leagues score circulates among enthusiasts who tracked it down and preserved it. The people who worked to preserve it understood something important. When the physical ride is gone, the music and the memory are often all that's left. It also occupies a specific nostalgia band for guests who were children in the 1970s and 1980s. Theme park nostalgia is a real and powerful phenomenon, and the submarine ride is one of its most cited reference points. People who were 7 years old in 1978 and grabbed the edge of their seat when the squid appeared are now in their 50s, and they haven't forgotten. As one longtime Disney fan wrote in an online tribute years after the closure, "I've been to Disney World probably 30 times since they closed it. I still walk to that corner of Fantasyland and think about what used to be there. I know that sounds crazy. It was a theme park ride, but it mattered. What it represented." 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea at Disney World was never just a ride. It was a direct link to Walt Disney's personal creative vision. The man himself had championed the submarine format, had pushed for the 1954 film, and had seen both the cinematic and the park versions of Jules Verne's story as part of a unified storytelling enterprise. When Walt Disney World opened in 1971, the attraction was already a legacy piece, a continuation of something Walt had started in Anaheim in the 1950s. It carried that original creative DNA into the Florida park and held it there for 23 years. Walt had died in December 1966, 5 years before the Florida park opened. He never saw Walt Disney World in operation, but 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was one of the clearest through lines from his personal creative priorities to the finished park, a direct manifestation of his belief that the best park experiences transported people to places they could never otherwise go. The ocean floor qualified. Its closure marked something more than the end of a single attraction. It was part of a broader shift in how Disney thought about its parks, from places that maintained and deepened their own history to places that constantly renovated in pursuit of the newest intellectual property. That shift produced extraordinary new attractions over the following decades. It also produced permanent losses that a vocal segment of Disney's most loyal guests never stopped mourning. The Jules Verne story itself is still out there, still being read, still being adapted, still capturing imaginations more than 150 years after it was written. Captain Nemo and the Nautilus have never really gone away. Multiple film and television adaptations have followed the 1954 Disney version. The character has appeared in comics, video games, and stage productions. The idea of a brilliant, solitary man navigating the world's oceans in a technologically impossible submarine, operating outside society's rules, that idea has proven stubbornly durable. But the specific version of that story that Disney built in a lagoon in Orlando and operated for 23 years and then quietly dismantled, that one is gone for good. And that is the full story of the rise and fall of Disney World's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. If this brought back some memories or taught you something you didn't know, hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into theme park history, forgotten attractions, and the stories behind the places that shaped our childhoods. New videos every week.